This is your daily dose of all things royal.
Where do you stand on the WEF, the World Economic Forum?
It is like, we shouldn't be paying any attention. It's a billionaires' boys club as arranging the world to shift wealth upward and to clamp down totalitarian controls on everybody else. And now they got the capacity to do it. They got all these countries running around doing what they tell them to do. It's astonishing to me that, these people go to Davos in their private jets.
Yes.
And they're able to tell these world leaders, how to govern us in ways that eradicate our constitutional and civil rights and constantly shifting wealth. I mean, COVID, but we shifted $4 trillion of wealth upward. We closed all the little guys.
Yeah.
And
Home Depot was open,
and Google, and they're all colluding with each other to censor the people who are like me who are complaining about it.
Correct.
Welcome back, my gorgeous, good-looking friends. What appeared maybe 7-8 years ago as conspiracy theory, that there is this organization looking to get together and push a one-world agenda, is no longer conspiracy anymore. If you can't wake up at this moment, I don't know what else to tell you, but they're not being quiet anymore about it. They are full force saying we all need to work together because we're global, and forcing us into this new world order that, quite frankly, is terrifying. Whether they intended this or not, but going towards Agenda 2030, it is obvious that what's happening here is that they are driving out the middle class, in which we will eventually see, if we continue on this dangerous path, of one being for just the uber elites, meaning the parasitic elites, and then the rest of us who are going to have to sacrifice and try to make ends meet as things are going to become so difficult to just simply live. When we look at today's Western world that are so in favor of this democracy, aka socialism, we see that every one of our countries that is supposedly free are having the very same societal problems. Now, in the United States, racism is something that is rife and it's getting worse. But now we have all these other countries that never had racism as a big problem, like the United Kingdom is probably one of the most ethnically diverse countries I know of. And all of a sudden now race is like the focal point. No, I'm not buying it. This is all man-generated to cause division, to cause chaos, to cause the society to break down so that these people at the top can take over. The biggest thing that's standing in the way for these elitist parasites to achieve this global dominance is, you guessed it, free speech. Hence the reason why you see all the Western countries at the very same time be pushing regulation and passing laws in order to control the information online, as well as violate people's privacy and turn us into this global surveillance state. It's a very scary thing, and it's a very real thing. It's happening under our very noses, and we are being distracted by bullshit news, such as saturating the media on the next person receiving Meghan Markle's stinky jam. Like, who really cares? Again, another distraction. Nobody's talking about what's going to happen in May when the United States signs over its sovereignty of its people over to the World Health Organization. For my American listeners there, understand that our constitutional rights are being threatened. And the biggest threat to the rest of the world at this moment for these globalists is our First Amendment. It's angering to me to see how a lot of this censorship that we're seeing all around the world is being driven by American bureaucrats who sold out to the World Economic Forum. Take a listen to what Michael Schellenberger had to say recently about Australia and the new censorship battle that Elon Musk is facing over his platform X.
Ex-owner Elon Musk should be thrown in prison, said a senator in Australia yesterday, because he refuses to delete a video of a recent stabbing from the entire X platform globally.
When it comes to the tech billionaire, like I've already said, I think he's a social media knob with no social conscience. He has absolutely no social conscience. Someone like that should be in jail and the key be thrown away.
But what's truly disgusting behavior here is calling for the incarceration of someone for not censoring the entire global internet. It's simply not the right of any nation to decide what should be on the internet around the world. No president, prime minister, or judge, said Elon Musk, has authority over all the earth. He's right. Now look, it's true that violent content online can be very disturbing, and I personally think platforms should put warning labels on them and find some way to prevent minors from seeing them. I also think there's some real privacy concerns that should be addressed, but that does not justify the Australian government censoring the entire global internet of content it does not like. And violence is not the only thing that the Australian government has told X to remove. It's also targeted political speech. What's more, there's something really suspicious about what Australia demands right now. Australia is asking for the same thing that Brazil wanted: the power to censor the whole internet.
Sounds very much like what Meghan and Harry have been trying to do.
Many of us, myself included, have long suspected that government censors around the world, from Ireland, Scotland, the European Union, would attempt to censor the whole of the internet, not just in their own countries. And they would do so by using the excuse that people can get around national firewalls with virtual private networks known as VPNs.
Speaking of VPNs, who remembers back in March of 2022 when a certain crypto scammer had went on and on abusing and harassing online a woman by the name of Yankee Wally? Let's remember he made it a point to drill home the fact that Yankee Wally had mentioned that she was using a VPN. And then in the Netflix mockumentary, he was quoted by saying they were actively recruiting people, telling people how to create multiple accounts, how to use VPNs, virtual private networks, to hide the IP so they don't get suspended. Wonder why he was so fixated on that point, as well as being fixated on the monetization of these so-called quote-unquote hate accounts.
Public has now learned that there's a formal government censorship network called the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, which Australia's top internet censor, Julie Inman Grant, who's an American, described at, you guessed it, the World Economic Forum.
Let me pause for a second because I need to point this out. When you look at the observer status and the observers listed, who is number one on that list? Hopefully you recognize that name, Five Rights, because Five Rights is in partnership with, you guessed it, Harry and Meghan at Archwell. In addition to Archwell collaborating with Five Rights, Prince Harry has been a past speaker for this foundation. So tell me you're a part of the censorship industrial complex without telling me you're a part of the censorship industrial complex.
The group includes censors from Australia, France, Ireland, South Africa, Korea, the UK, and Fiji. But before getting into all that, it's first important to understand just how powerful this Australian censor is. Here's Julie Inman Grant boasting of her extraordinary censorship powers.
Hi, I'm Julie Inman Grant, Australia's E-Safety Commissioner.
I attended the World Economic Global Summit as the E-Safety Commissioner.
Where do you think freedom of expression online should be limited?
When it undermines other people's freedom of expression and causes significant harm. But that's all I have to say.
But that's a subjective term. Like, who's to adjudicate what harm is? Is it governments?
Well, actually, it is the government.
We first met was when you were working with Twitter.
That's right.
So you really understand the evolution, the development of these social media platforms from the inside.
When I joined Twitter in 2014, of course, I was empowered by the whole mission of the organization to provide freedom of expression, democratize voices, speak truth to power.
Do you believe that the First Amendment has too high a bar for the online era?
The First Amendment does not apply in Australia.
I know, but you're an American, so I thought in general, as a standard for freedom of expression, do you think that's too high of one?
No, I don't apply that. I apply the laws of the Australian government.
Are you setting yourself up as an arbiter of what should and should not be seen online?
No, I am not.
I think we're going to have to think about a recalibration of a whole range of human rights that are playing out online, from freedom of speech.
Twitter's always been fiery in terms of discourse, but it's turned into an absolute bin fire. It's very, very hard to be permanently banned from Twitter. You have to be the most egregious, repetitive spewers of hate.
Well, I'd like the witness to give me examples of Australian accounts that X had allowed back that your office objects to. That's my question, and you haven't answered it.
I didn't ask them specific questions about which accounts that there were. I asked for the quantum of the numbers.
Who are these accounts? Are they given special dispensation? Are they able to tweet without immunity, particularly if they're paying for a Twitter Blue subscription?
I didn't ask them specific questions about which accounts that there were. I asked for the quantum of the numbers.
What we want to know is Who are these accounts?
Thank you. At the World Economic Forum planning session in Davos, you said, quote,
We've started something called the Global Online Safety Regulators Network.
who is we? Did you receive ministerial permission to involve Australia in another globalist power sinkhole? You may laugh, but that's facing a big threat.
So we as governments have to work together to counter the wealth, the stealth, and frankly, the power of all these technology companies. And we need to work together to really force them to do better.
Who decides what the forces of good are? You?
They cut their safety engineers by 80%, their content moderators by 30%, their public policy people by 70%, and then they enabled previously suspended users. So it's like, Volvo firing their designers, their engineers, and then not letting the traffic infraction people and the ambulance in while putting all these dangerous drivers back on the road. You're creating a perfect storm.
Can you give me examples of Australian accounts that X has allowed back on that your office objects to?
Well, what we want to know is, who are these accounts? Are they given special dispensation? Are they able to tweet without immunity, particularly if they're paying for a Twitter Blue subscription?
You're assuming the previous bans were in order. Have you explored those previous bans before coming to that judgment?
Well, so Twitter, as the company, had a whole range of policies, including a hateful conduct policy. They remove or they.
So you haven't. What you've done is you've gone off their interpretation of their policy, even though we know they were biased.
Well, that's the only thing we can do, Senator.
Could you come back to my question, please, and give me?
Yes, we do regulate the platforms. We have a big stick that we can use when we want to. They're going to be regulated, and they're going to be regulated in ways that they don't want to be regulated. So, we also have some pretty significant ISP blocking powers. We just had some new powers given to us.
In a different video, Inman Grant says,
in addition to be able to compel that takedown, to be able to fine perpetrators as a deterrent effect, and fine content hosts that don't take down this content.
She goes on to say that she is already working with Ireland, the UK, France, and other governments around the world.
We know we're going to go much further when we work together with other like-minded independent statutory authorities around the globe. With the UK, with Ireland, and with Fiji, in November 2022, we launched the Global Online Safety Regulators Network. That has now grown to 7 independent regulators, including France, South Korea, and South Africa, and a number of countries are serving as observers.
Inman Grant said that she had launched this global censorship body, the Global Online Safety Regulators, in order to unify governments around a censorship agenda.
November, and we launched the Global Online Safety Regulators Network so that we could have a forum to help us coordinate, build capacity, and do just that, but also make sure that while we're going to have differences in our regulatory schemes, there would be common values that drive us together. We want to prevent fragmentation and regulatory fragmentation. We know that's a challenge for the platforms as well.
This global censorship body gives governments extraordinary powers to invade privacy, not just censor. Listen to this.
What this legislation will give us the ability to do is to compel basic device information and account information. And more and more social media companies are starting to collect phone numbers and email addresses so that our investigators can at least find a place to issue a notice or a takedown notice or an infringement notice of some sort.
I like to point out a fun fact about this treasonous American super Karen, Julie, is that she is a Meghan Markle supporter. As you can see in 2021, when Safiya Noble wrote her article in The Cut, A Bunch of Lies, The Fight for Meghan's Life, Julie steps in to talk about how, says this is sad commentary on broader society demonstrating that racism, misogyny, homophobia are alive and well and surfaced by social media. The platforms can detect these signals, particularly when vulnerable or intersectional users are receiving an avalanche of hate and need to act. Well, here's the thing, Julie. How come you didn't come back after it was found that the information that Safiya Noble wrote about was not actually true. It was disinformation. And then went on to quote from that article the quote that Safiya Noble used from Christopher Boozy's Bot Sentinel Report of Lies, in which she writes, these troll accounts weren't bots, just highly coordinated. 83 accounts with a potential reach of 17 million users were responsible for 70% of the negative and hateful content generated about the couple. Exactly what eSafety Office sees without volumetric abuse, online death by 1,000 cuts. So here she is repeating disinformation, even though Twitter came back and said that there was no evidence of a coordinated campaign against Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. But nobody bothered to clean that up. She didn't retract this tweet. She left it up. So here we have this hypocrite supporting an agenda that Meghan and Harry are clearly a part of and forcing these lies down our throats because this is the narrative that we're all supposed to believe when we know it wasn't true.
Grant is working with these other governments to stamp out now virtual private networks, which millions of people in China and other countries around the world use.
You can use VPNs, you can use burner phones, different SIM cards every day. So it's going to be a challenge for a long time because, again, the internet's global.
So what she's really doing here is complaining about these ability to access the internet. They're looking to stomp out any access to the free internet.
If there is no such thing as a kind of global identity system or even a piece of identity everybody can agree with, should we all be sharing our driver's license or a passport?
Over my dead body, these are the last people that you would want to have access to your personal data. But I've said many times over, this is what Meghan and Harry and the people that they have aligned with have been striving for with these researchers. They want these researchers to have access to your information so they could learn more about you. So if you are wrong thinking, they can sort of persuade or push or even coerce you into conforming to the ideology that they are forcing on us. And it's evident and it's clear that this is what they have been doing. But people have been waking up and seeing how wrong things are going and literally thinking for themselves again and seeing that we are being lied to. We have to recognize that if it wasn't for Elon Musk buying Twitter, we would never have known that this was existing in the background and what was happening to us. Well, we knew what was happening to us as far as Twitter taking down people and deplatforming people, as well as YouTube. We felt it, we saw it, but we couldn't explain why is it that the Sussex Squad, the most vile people on this earth who have been writing such hateful things, weren't even touched. Same thing with Boozy for his harassment and online trolling and doxing. He was never touched. Now, many of you know I have been watching this whole saga and have been very close to it over the last 4 years now. I have particularly paid close attention to what had been going on within the Megza community as a result of listening to stories that like Murky Meg would tell, Yankee Wally, and Taz about the harassment, the doxing, as well as the vileness of the Sussex Squad and connecting it all back. So after the Twitter files came out and seeing the timeline of when people were being deplatformed in bulk, not only on Twitter, but also on YouTube, and then enter in Bot Sentinel out of nowhere, to which he's all of a sudden now running reports just on Meghan Markle, when prior he was running reports on conservatives and Trump supporters. Also, what became obvious was that there were certain topics that you were not allowed to talk about concerning the Duke and Duchess, such as the topic of questioning the line of succession and the validity of Meghan's pregnancies. We know that anyone back during that time frame when everyone was being deplatformed, anyone who did talk about Meghan's bump would then either be demonetized, either be suspended on Twitter, either be censored on Facebook. I mean, this was across the board, and we just couldn't figure it out. Well, now we know what had been going on. Mike Benz, who is the executive director for the Foundation for Freedom Online, by the way, is a former State Department official who had responsibilities in formulating and negotiating U.S. foreign policy on international communications and information technology matters, has the best insight and documentation surrounding what the government had been doing and the players that had been involved. For those that don't understand what we have been seeing over the last couple of years and how Meghan and Harry fit into this censorship industrial complex and the role that they were playing, Mike Benz does an excellent job at explaining how this came to be and what is being forced upon us. So, throughout this video, what I'm going to be doing is mapping back to where Harry and Meghan fit in because I think it's important we all understand how serious this is of having this foreign prince here on US soil undermining and essentially overthrowing our government by doing this. These are our constitutional rights, and we have a foreign agent here who's not registered. This is why we need to know his visa status. Capiche? Okay. Names that are going to come up in this video, such as Kate Starbird, Chris Krebs, and Alex Stamos, please keep in the back of your mind that Harry worked with them on this Commission on Information Disorder at Aspen. Also, who was mentioned is Renee DiResta, who's ex-CIA. So keep those folks, those four people in the back of your head as we go through this video.
Today I'm going to break down one of the biggest government scandals in the entire history of the 21st century through the lens of breaking down the deceptive framing devices used by the Washington Post this week to try to stop the scandal's public exposure. What I've done here is I've highlighted this whole article, and every one of these highlights is going to elucidate a deeper aspect of the scandal. This is intended to be a deep dive analysis for those who are totally new here and you just want a primer on the whole thing, which is essentially the story of how hundreds of millions of social media posts across Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, every single platform on the American internet was censored ahead of the 2020 elections, during the 2022 midterm elections, and during the entire COVID-19 pandemic. This is essentially the story of how the government, the private sector, civil society, and news media and fact-checking orgs fused into the cell of a single atom, essentially, to form what was called their whole-of-society response to censoring the internet.
Addressing disinformation requires a whole-of-society approach.
Countering disinformation. We often talk about a whole-of-society response.
From a citizen standpoint, and we hear this term all the time, a problem like disinformation, fighting disinformation, really requires a whole-of-society response. And I know whole-of-society is a little bit cliche and a term that gets thrown around a lot.
I think the solution has to be whole of society, which is a word that we throw around a lot, especially in venues like these, right? We need cooperation from the tech platforms, but we also need people in the government who are willing to say, yes, this is a problem, and it's not just about foreign actors.
This is going to be a pretty advanced talk aimed to educate policymakers and investigators who have a certain baseline background in this. If you're new and you want the world's best primer on it, simply go to this primer at Foundation for Freedom Online. It breaks down the entire thing, the networks, the funding, the scale and scope of the censorship that was done, who all was involved, why they did it, their confession videos essentially on tape. You will walk away from this with a PhD in the scandal. But I'm going to use this lecture for a deep dive. But again, if you want it linearly, simply go right here. So the Washington Post reached out to me this week telling me that they were going to be running this piece, and I had a conversation with Gabe Kaminsky from the Washington Examiner about my expectations. I told Gabe ahead of time that the piece would be indistinguishable from a ChatGPT auto-aggregation of all of the press releases of the federal government and EIP, simply taking their word for what they say without any interrogation of the mountains of underlying evidence, confession videos, source documents. I told Gabe that the article is going to deflect by using words like researcher and study instead of using the word censorship or flagging. It's going to try to characterize them as nebbish professors rather than as government-partnered operatives. And it is probably going to even include, and I said this directly, and you can ask Gabe, I said it's probably also going to have a picture of one of the stars of the story, like Alex Stamos or Renee DiResta or Kate Starbird, and it's going to have soft lighting, and it's going to be middle distance, and the person is going to be looking slightly away from the camera in a kind of angelic, mysterious hue to really drive home the mystery. I said they'll probably even send out a photo team to do it, And as you can see, it turns out they actually used a picture from March for this, but it feels like that scene from 8 Mile where Eminem sort of says what the the other guy is going to rap about before it comes out. I called each and every aspect of this, and you're going to find out now why this was so predictable and how and what a mistake they made by bringing this to me. So let's now tell this story through the lens of cutting through the deceptive framing devices that the Washington Post uses here. We'll start with the title. These academics studied falsehoods spread by Trump. Now the GOP wants answers. Let's start with the word academics. This is a word used to mislead you. These are not academics. These are government cutouts. I'm going to say that again. These are not academics, certainly not in any classical sense that matches any definition that you probably associate with an academic. These are government cutouts. They are self-aware that they are government cutouts. The government itself is self-aware that the universities are government cutouts. In fact, the head of EIP, the Election Integrity Partnership, the head of the 120-person censorship consortium, partnered with the Department of Homeland Security, even described his university department and EIP writ large as a government cutout.
There was a lack of capability around election disinformation. This is not because CISA didn't care about disinformation, but at the time they lacked both kind of the funding and the legal authorizations to go do the kinds of work that would be necessary to truly understand how election disinformation was operating. So because of the feedback and the ideas from this group, we were able to pull together pretty quickly a project between these 4 different institutions to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves. CISA lacked the legal authorizations, so we were able to pull together a project to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves.
So understand what he just said right there. This is Alex Stamos, the head of Stanford University's censorship lab, the Stanford Internet Observatory, the head of the entire EIP consortium with Stanford, UW, Graphica, and the Atlanta Council, saying that CISA, the censorship subagency within DHS, wanted to do this counter misinformation work, which, as you will see, is just straight up censorship work. That's it. It's not research. It's mass flagging and programming the algorithms to tune you out of existence. And he is saying the federal government, CISA, wanted to do this, expressed an interest in doing this, but they knew that it was illegal. They lacked the legal authorizations. And so EIP was set up to fill the gaps of what the government could not do itself. This is what is called a government cutout. When the government wants to do something, but doesn't want to be seen doing it, it launders or outsources to a non-governmental private sector or civil society institution working closely behind the scenes with the government, so that technically, even though it's government sourced and government sought, the fingerprints are on an entity at the plausible deniable level at a non-governmental way. This is stuff the CIA does. When the State Department wants to carry out a deniable operation, doesn't want the US government's fingerprints on something, the CIA will carry it out, and it will work through a series of cutout organizations that don't look like they're government. They will work with private firms, and they will work with universities to launder the operation to remove the fingerprints. But here you have the head of EIP giving up the game, saying they only set it up because the government told them they couldn't do it. They were expressly set up as a cutout. The whole premise of using a word like academic is to present the academics as if they are independent, totally independent from the government, removed, making up their own minds, a firewall between them and the government. And yet not only were they partnered, and as we will see, using government-funded domestic disinformation switchboards to mass flag your posts, They were a birth child of the federal government. They asked the government for permission to exist. This is page 21 of EIP's 292-page tell-all report, in which they bragged about everything they did and got rewarded by the Biden administration with a joint $3 million government grant to do more censorship for the 2022 midterms and the 2024 election. They also sell this censorship structuring instruction manual to other universities. What you see on page 21 here is EIP's operational timeline, their self-described operational timeline. You'll see on June 9th, 2020, this is 4 months before the election, before election day of the last presidential election, EIP had a meeting with CISA to present EIP concept. So this is EIP, Alex Stamos, meeting with the government to present to the government their proposed solution for filling the gaps of what the government wanted to censor but could not do itself. You can't get more government cutout than that. Actually, you can. These are screenshots, citations in the FFO report, showing that every single entity in the Election Integrity Partnership, all 4 of them, Stanford, UW, Graphica, and the Atlanta Council, all are funded by the federal government. Graphica got about $7 million in Pentagon grants. The Atlanta Council gets funds from the Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID. And Stanford and UW, just months after the 2020 election that they censored, and 100% of their targets were the opposition to the Biden administration, the Biden administration magically gave them $3 million of your taxpayer funding to upscale them for censoring the 2022 midterms in 2024. That's a 5-year grant, $3 million for Alex Stamos and the rest, and Kate Starbird's groups. They asked for permission to exist. They, quote, presented the concept to CISA. The government told them that the government couldn't do it, so they need to exist to fill the government's gaps. They're all funded by the government, but wait, there's more. They're also a complete revolving door with government. Here you'll see that the head of CISA, Chris Krebs, in 2020, right after he left government, the first thing he did was he started a 2-man consultancy firm with the head of EIP, Alex Stamos. The head of the government side of the censorship and the head of the private sector side of the censorship literally went into business together the moment the government guy got kicked out of government. So the head of CISA gets in bed with Stanford University's Alex Stamos. How about the top deputy at CISA, Matt Masterson? What did he do when he left government? Well, he also went to Alex Stamos's Stanford University, Stanford Internet Observatory as a fellow right after leaving government. The top 2 guys rotated directly into the exact cutout that they had set up while in government. Alex Stamos, and it runs in reverse. It's not just the government with a revolving door to the universities. From the university side, Alex Stamos spent 2021 and 2022 directly on CISA's Cyber Hygiene Advisor Subcommittee. Renee DiResta gives lectures, as we will see, at CISA disinformation summits. Kate Starbird, who is the head of EIP's University of Washington unit, headed the Mis and Disinformation Subcommittee at CISA. So they're concurrently occupying these government advisory posts in addition to being funded by the government, coordinating with the government, being born out of the government, and rotating back and forth, totally indistinguishable. And in fact, the whole of society model is for them to be in lockstep. So understand, when you see this word academic, they are saying this to throw you off. They are saying this so that you don't see the word government, and so you don't see the word political operative. Through the academic institutions, they are raising a censorship mercenary army. As FFO has documented, $40 million have flowed from the Biden administration straight to 40 different universities. They have raised as a censorship mercenary army to do the same thing that Alex Stamos and Stanford and Kate Starbird and UW did in 2020. They wanted to control every sensitive policy issue and were only stopped because of political pushback in late 2022.
You might not have put two and two together, but in late of 2022, this is when we started to see a lot of the sugars dying off in the sense of going away, such as the Sussex Squad podcast ended up hiding a lot of their videos because there was a lot of vile and nasty things being said on there, as well as Sunshine Sachs was no longer representing Meghan Markle anymore.
Alex Stamos is not an academic. Alex Stamos got a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and computer science. No PhD, no teaching history, didn't come up through the system like an academic. He runs what's known as a center, where he spearheads the university's staff that does the censorship work. He is a political operative, and that center is simply used as a perch, a non-governmental perch for government-coordinated operations that the government itself couldn't get caught doing because it would be illegal if the government did it. So they launder it to Alex Stamos's university center, where the operative coordinating with the government can fill the gaps of what the government can't do itself. Now let's look at the next deceptive framing trick. The word studied. Now this is a big one. Just as the word academics is used, so you don't see the word government cut out, the word studied is used so you don't see the word censored. Now understand what they're trying to do here. They're trying to both indirectly suggest and in a sense directly say that they did not directly involve themselves in censorship, they simply studied misinformation. This would be like a nuclear physicist saying, we worked on the Manhattan Project as research scientists. We didn't actually drop the bombs out of the plane. They did both. They were, in a sense, not just the research scientists of the atom bomb. They were the battle planners of the war, and they personally drove the planes to drop them over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so to speak. And I'm going to show you how they did this. So we're going to start with a little game where I will play evidence, and you will ask yourself, is this EIP studying something or EIP censoring something? Is this EIP passively research something, or is this EIP actively flagging, actively pressuring, actively coercing, actively demanding, actively jawboning the tech companies to tear down information and what information to tear down, when, what, why, who, all the way down to graphs of highly specific individuals and tens of millions of posts in the aggregate. This interview is dated August 26, 2020. EIP's first day of activity was the very next week, September 3rd, right after this interview. And you will hear Alex Stamos describe how he lined up the tech companies in order to get them to take stuff down. Not to assist in the research, to take stuff down.
So we have reached out and we have had two-way conversations with all of the major platforms, right? So we've had really good conversations with Facebook, Twitter, Google, Reddit. We've talked to TikTok. That's actually been very productive. Some of the smaller groups, Discord. There's a bunch of companies that didn't really exist or they were much smaller in 2016 and are now real players. So that's been good. I think, our goal with that is that if we're able to find disinformation, that we'll be able to report it quickly and then collaborate with them on taking it down. And there's a good precedent for this, which all four of these organizations have worked on research projects side by side with tech platforms.
Oh, so they're using the research relationship to then, I'm sorry, what was that? What did you say that? Say that again?
And that we'll be able to report it quickly. If we're able to find disinformation, that we'll be able to report it quickly and then collaborate with them on taking it down. And there's a
taking it down. So, again, look at our operational timeline. EIP, Alex Stamos, had a meeting with the government, the federal government, CISA, to present the concept of an outside censorship consortium. They're saying it was to study misinformation, But the studying was only the first step. After the studying came the taking it down part. And in fact, he actively colluded with every single tech platform ahead of time. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, even the small ones, to line them up so that Alex Stamos and his 120 staffers could report it quickly and take it down the moment EIP went live with the federal government, which was September 3rd, 2020, the very week after that interview. So in that intervening period between when he cooked up the idea with the federal government and when the Censorship Consortium went live is when he was lining up all of the tech platforms so that they would be in a position to quickly censor the information Stamos flagged. Now, I'm focusing on Alex Stamos here because he is the head of EIP. He's also the head of Stanford University, and he's also the one who had the closest relationship, the two-man consultancy, just him and the head of the very federal government agency they partnered with for censorship. But Alex Stamos had 120 people, a huge teams, gigantic teams is how they describe.
You're seeing 5 of us right now, but again, there's like 120 people who worked on this. I want to make sure all the people in the audience understand that there's huge teams behind each of us.
Gigantic teams.
Gigantic. Here in EIP's report on page 200 and all throughout the report is their description of nearly 5,000 individual posts, again, First Amendment protected posts about your opinions about elections that EIP manually flagged, manually submitted in their tickets to the tech platforms to take stuff down. And you can see examples of the URLs, the First Amendment protected, totally benign, banal, always protected by Americans to be able to talk to each other about, is the issue that they flagged in their own tickets for Sharpiegate. Here you see on the screen the censorship collusion screenshots included in their own report, where EIP submits a ticket to the tech platforms, all of them, TikTok, Facebook, Google, Twitter, as well as EI-ISAC, which I'll describe later.
Let me pause for a second. For my international crowd, I know that this might be not of interest to you because this is about the US election. The whole point of listening to this is understanding how this whole engine was working, because once they proved this to be successful, they went on to censoring other topics. So just hang and listen to how they laid this out in their justification, and it'll make more sense.
Where Sharpiegate, they say, is trending on Twitter. They show a slew of URLs to take down or to action under remove, reduce, and form, which is just censoring by banning it, censoring it by adding friction so it's de-amplified, or censoring it through a fact check label. It's all censorship. It's all intended to de-amplify, to take the stuff down or to stop it from going viral. An EIP member says, "Hello, platform partners. We've added you on several different cases of claims which are going viral right now." So they are actively organizing every tech platform on earth in the United States so that they can all collectively take down viral claims being made by U.S. citizens protected by the First Amendment. And on top of that, they rally them to do a counter-narrative. This is as active censorship and as active political engineering as you can possibly get. And not only that, they had the audacity to redact the government partners. These are government communications. These are communications with government officials. All of this is a violation of the National Records Act. Why aren't these tickets discoverable through FOIA? Why is Stanford holding them rather than the government partners? There should never be a government partner name redacted unless something's classified. And as you'll see, there's a damn good reason why they're trying to not disclose these tickets, because it's where the bodies are buried in the censorship industry. But we'll get to that. Now we get to the big whopper. We've already established it's not studying. It was active flagging for takedown. It was active collusion with the federal government and the tech platforms themselves for takedown. It was a government cutout doing the taking down. But how do you get to the scale of hundreds of millions of social media posts? This was introduced through an incredibly devious trick called delegitimization. Delegitimization was the brainchild of EIP to coerce the tech platforms, exploiting their fears of being punished by Washington allies of EIP, exploiting their fear of huge regulatory pressure and crisis PR communications from bad press, to get them to add a terms of service violation policy called delegitimization that banned all questions about the legitimacy of election processes, outcomes, or election integrity issues, including and especially mail-in ballots. Tens of millions of social media posts about mail-in ballots alone were all banned in the United States of America because a government cutout, a monstrosity born out of the Department of Homeland Security and EIP, bragged that they were responsible for the tech companies adopting this vast terms of service policy change that instantaneously made tens of millions of posts a bannable offense, a bannable speech police infraction.
I think EIP really helped push the envelope with things like just the notion that this delegitimization of electoral processes that we were seeing in the summer and early fall, that this should be against content moderation policies on these platforms.
So you just heard him say that it was EIP who got the tech companies to push the envelope to adopt delegitimization as a terms of service policy, delegitimization of mail-in ballots, delegitimization of early voting drop boxes, articulating any of the legal challenges in the courts, agreeing with one of the candidates in the race in the election. And it was EIP who got them to take the proactive steps to enforce the policy that they jawboned them, as we will see, to adopt.
They began to take proactive steps there. We did get industry partners to push the envelope a little bit in the U.S. context. But how can a similar kind of pressure and responsiveness be elicited from platforms when it's not a U.S. election with huge regulatory stakes for these companies?
We did get industry partners, meaning the tech platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, Reddit, to adopt this terms of service policy change, this censorship policy, this speech restriction policy, things you cannot talk about in America online anymore. And what he says is we got them to do it because there were, quote, huge regulatory stakes for them if they didn't. And they're worried that they won't have the same influence over the tech platforms when they can't command that kind of pressure on the companies on the regulatory side, meaning congressional allies like Senator Mark Warner or Amy Klobuchar or Elizabeth Warren, who are all threatening to break up the tech companies if action wasn't taken, or to regulate them through the FTC out of profitability. And now you're going to hear Alex Stamos articulate the two-step plan by which you get tens of millions of social media posts removed, reduced, or informed across all of these platforms. Here is the Stamos two-step.
My suggestion is if people want to get the platforms to do stuff is first, you got to push for written policies. And so this is something we started in the summer. In August is, as Kate talked about, Carly Miller led a team from all four institutions to look at the detailed policies of the big platforms and to measure them against situations that we expected to happen. Now, we're not going to take credit for all the changes they made, but we had to update this thing like 8 or 9 times, right? And so like putting these people in a grid to say, you're not handling this, you're not handling this, not handling this, creates a lot of pressure inside the companies and forces them to kind of grapple with these issues because you want specific policies that you can hold them accountable for. The second is when you report stuff to them, report how it's violating those written policies, right? So there's 2 steps here. Get good policies and then say, this is how it's violating it. We will have our statistics, right? But I think we were pretty effective in getting them to act on things that they hadn't acted on before.
They were effective at getting the tech platforms to censor content that they didn't censor before. And they did it through 2 steps. They used the threat of regulatory action by the government combined with crisis PR to generate pressure for the companies if they were shown censorship policies adopted by their peers and made to look like they were a platform for misinformation, which in their words created huge pressure inside the companies. And you'll notice how Stamos very carefully tries to hedge by talking about things and stuff rather than saying the word censor.
We're not going to take credit for all the changes they made.
He's saying we're not going to take credit for all of them because he knows that they have to have some semblance of independence. But he's taking credit for some of them. This is the government. This is the government's hand-picked partner and hand-selected cutout, also funded by the government, also doing this censorship through government-funded technology through the domestic disinformation switchboard.
But we had to update this thing like 8 or 9 times.
What he's referring to is the grid they created for all of the platform policies of every single tech platform, and then pressuring every single one of them to say, Facebook is censoring mail-in ballots. Why aren't you? Why aren't you? You know there's going to be bad PR for you if you, Twitter, are not in line with best practices on stopping misinformation. And then the hit pieces come as they did, and one by one, all of them folded. And they articulate this as being the effective plan. And these people had the chutzpah to call all of that studying. By EIP's own math, this is page 201 of their own report, EIP classified 22 million tweets in just the 2020 election cycle alone as being misinformation terms of service violations, i.e. censorable, under the very terms of service policy they jawboned the companies to adopt when they didn't want to adopt them and wouldn't have done otherwise. And they bragged about this on tape. Now, when Foundation for Freedom Online broke this 22 million tweet figure, EIP responded in a panic, trying to argue that these 22 million tweets they identified as misinformation, they identified them after the election, don't you know? So it's 22 million, yeah, but that's not what we flagged, that was what we assessed after the election. This is extremely devious on their part. An outrageous limited hangout they're trying to pull here. Those 22 million tweets were made before the election, or before all the processes to challenge election results that were still being processed in the courts. That is, all of these tweets were made between the summer of 2020 and December of 2020. So they were all during the election cycle, these 22 million. And wouldn't you know, the very first day that EIP formally began operations, remember, they started all the way back in June. They were doing concept presentation meetings to CISA then, but the very first day they formally set up shop was the very day that Facebook changed its terms of service to ban delegitimization, meaning anybody who delegitimizes the validity of mail-in ballots, early voting drop boxes, or any of the voting procedures that were still being litigated in the state assemblies, anyone who delegitimized them, that's tens of millions of Americans no longer able to talk about mail-in ballots because a government cutout, a government-partnered censorship consortium, expressly set up because the government wasn't allowed to do it itself, jawboned Facebook to adopt that policy. And the very following week, September 10th, Twitter did as well. So those 22 million tweets that were terms of service violations as misinformation, meaning censored under the delegitimization policy. That delegitimization policy was only put in place in Twitter because of EIP, and it was done so on September 10th, which meant those 22 million tweets were all bannable only because EIP stepped in to jawbone them for the entire election cycle. So that's 22 million tweets that EIP targeted for takedown. Case closed. And then remember, you have to add in all of these platforms. That's 22 million just on Twitter alone. Facebook, Pinterest, also September 3rd, first day of EIP operations. Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, Nextdoor, everyone folded to EIP and the powerful network of congressional allies and major national security figures behind them. And that's why you couldn't talk about the last election. And as we'll see, it's also why you couldn't talk about the many aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, another trick that EIP used was to distinguish between incidents and narratives. Misinformation incidents, meaning individual posts, and misinformation narratives, which can comprise millions of posts. You'll see here these misinformation narratives that they identify. Everything from the Dominion voting machines to the entire Stop the Steal concept or movement, Sharpiegate, narratives around poll watcher issues, the Postal Service, dead voter rolls, Antifa and the Sunrise Zoom calls. And you'll see here EIP attaches in their own internal documents the approximate number of tweets related to the misinformation narratives, that is, the banned narratives. Some of these have millions or hundreds of thousands, 7 million, 3 million, 800,000, 600,000. These are all automatically downranked under remove, reduce, inform. And they were tickets for all of these, and they're refusing to turn them over. These are tickets that combine the federal government, EIP, and every single tech platform on Earth, or at least in America, all plotting to ban you from talking about dozens of narratives and 66 discrete narratives for COVID, according to their own document. When they lie straight to your face and tell you they only censored things having to do with time, place, and manner of voting.
We had a narrowly tailored scope focused on false and misleading narratives specific to voting.
Ask them what the Sunrise Zoom calls, the Antifa phone calls are doing on this censored list, with hundreds of thousands of misinformation tagged posts there. Or how they censored the color revolution concerns articulated by Darren Beatty's Revolver, which is also referenced as a misinformation narrative in EIP's report. You see, one trick that EIP plays is when they deem something to be a misinformation narrative, they no longer need to argue that each individual post, each individual tweet is a terms of service violation. If the misinformation narrative is declared banned, then it doesn't matter whether you are right or wrong. If it's malinformation, even if you're right, you are still advancing a narrative that is deemed wrong. It is the great catch-all they used to ban, as we'll see, 66 discrete narratives, covering everything from vaccines to masks to the efficacy of lockdown policies for the COVID-19 pandemic. This is building to be the blueprint for every sensitive policy issue in our democracy. But I'm not weighing in on the substance of any of these narratives. I don't know whether any of these are right or wrong. I don't make a substantive point on these. It's about freedom of speech and freedom on the internet. Never before in American history have people been banned from being able to talk about an ongoing election, especially with that banning coming straight from the Department of Homeland Security through a deliberately constructed cutout to disguise the U.S. government's leadership role. Now, we've only covered the tip of the iceberg here. A proxy is something that you are trying to attack without making it look like you're attacking that way. That is something you're really trying to go after when you're going after something else.
So here's the question. With this whole coordinated effort of the Sussex Squad and Meghan's PR machine and what Harry has been doing here in the United States, is the proxy going after the racist royal family a way to go ahead and destabilize the UK? I mean, I'm just throwing that out there because you can see how Meghan's tactics in attacking and weaponizing the media have been against the royal family. A lot of the stuff that Meghan did didn't make sense, especially with the bold-faced lies, unless she had people behind her that said, you know what, everything is going to be okay. Go forward with this lie. Nobody's going to challenge you, and we'll keep moving forward. And look what happened. When Meghan did this Oprah interview and accused the royal family of being racist or unconscious bias now, according to Harry, the US media really didn't challenge Meghan. And in fact, like still to this day, people are still supportive of Meghan, or at least from the media standpoint, they're not reporting on all of her lies. They're still continuing with this BS and nonsense as if it never happened.
So, like a good example of this is like the Russiagate scandal. Yeah, that was said to be going after Russian disinformation after allegations by the CIA and other intelligence services that Russia had interfered with the 2016 election. These claims were never validated, never substantiated. The Justice Department dropped both of its cases against the IRA. Leave all that aside. They said that they were going after Russian disinformation, but that was a proxy attack on populist parties on both the left and the right. That is, the populist right was censored through as a proxy of Russia when Trump was called a Russian asset, or when Bernie Sanders was when he ran for president in the early days against Joe Biden in the last election cycle, or Jeremy Corbyn on the populist left was also called a Russian asset. So they're actual targets. Who the Atlantic Council's DFR lab, who the German Marshall Fund, who ISD.
As you can see, the ISD is a major player here. And let's not forget that Meghan has on her payroll from ISD, Jory Craig.
Who Graphica, all of them targeted these proxies. They weren't really going after Russiagate. They were operating under a pretext. So that is, they were saying they're going after Russia, but that was actually a pretext to go after Trump supporters, Brexit supporters, Jeremy Corbyn supporters, Bernie Sanders supporters, anyone who challenged that bipartisan, multi-decades foreign policy establishment from either the right or the left. But in order to get away with that pretext, they have to lay a predicate for doing so. And so originally it was Russian disinformation. And this predicate was very useful because national security is one of those predicates that once you lay it, it's very difficult to be able to come up with a reason to overrule it because it's said to be existential, it's defense of the homeland. But as it turned out, you just couldn't squeeze Russian disinformation into every social media post under the sun. And so they had to expand the sets of predicates that were laid to be able to censor every nook and cranny of the internet that was politically inconvenient. So in 2017, for example, this same network amped up the so-called hate speech censorship predicate.
Do you see how all of this is fitting together? Right off the bat, remember when it was exposed that Meghan was dating Harry? Like 8 days later, Harry writes this press release to say, lay off my girlfriend, like the harassment is terrible, blah, blah, blah. And then in 2017, in the engagement interview, you have the discussion around the hate that was being spewed for her being a biracial woman or black.
That is when all the terms of services on the tech companies all changed their terms to ban various forms of hate speech. And in Germany, NetzDG was passed in August 2017 that banned it as a matter of law and had £54 million penalties for any incident of hate speech left up on the platform for more than 48 hours. Which then required artificial intelligence censorship to be able to censor at scale, ushering in that whole new era. But at the time, the censorship thought leaders who rolled out this hate speech censorship predicate were very acutely aware of its role as a predicate in their geopolitical machinations, if you will. That is, this same group was deeply concerned at the time that right-wing populist parties, after Brexit, we're going to cause Frexit in France with Marine Le Pen, Italexit in Italy with Matteo Salvini, Spexit in Spain with the Vox Party, Grexit in Greece, and the EU would come undone, NATO would come undone. Therefore, all these folks in the defense, diplomacy, intelligence apparatus thought that the only way to save the Western world, the rules-based international order, was to censor all these right-wing populist groups. Now, the thing that all these right-wing populist groups at the time had in common was a common reaction to the 2013 to 2015 so-called migrant crisis after Libya was toppled by NATO, and there was a massive push up through Italy, basically all through Europe, especially with the approval of Angela Merkel in Germany, which caused this sort of right-wing populist political reaction to it. Now, those same political factions were also very keen on Russian oil and gas because it's very cheap and was therefore said to be, preferred by the sort of working classes in those countries who just wanted cheap energy. So all of these represented a geopolitical threat to NATO energy stakeholders, and hate speech was championed as a way to lay a predicate for targeting all these right-wing populist groups for other beliefs that they held. So again, it was a proxy attack on political groups. They went after AfD in Germany, who supported the Nord Stream pipeline. Marine Le Pen in France. All these groups were targeted by that predicate. Same thing with targeted abuse and harassment, which was a terms of service modification that was rolled out by all the social media companies in late 2017, 2018. It began to be really strongly enforced.
Now, I'm just going to speculate, but those that have been special enough to be deplatformed, demonetized, suspended, banned off of various social media platforms, the reasons that probably were given to you was for targeted harassment and abuse of a person of protected class, right? And I think that Meghan played up being Black and using her Black card almost in every situation with these sugars in order to get people taken down.
And that was a proxy attack on just dissent against the journalist and gatekeeper media class. Targeted abuse and harassment was defined essentially to mean anyone who embarrasses a blue-check journalist in a reply. This is at a time when comment sections were closing because of people rebutting mainstream media journalists in the comments. It was at a time when Twitter actually mass banned thousands of accounts who were using the hashtag #LearnToCode, because learn to code was said to be targeted abuse and harassment to tell a fired journalist that they should learn to code, which is the same thing journalists were saying about coal miners. So it was just a meme, but it was used as a pretext to censor the real proxy, who were just dissidents who disagreed with the gatekeepers. But you can't just censor speech without looking like an authoritarian and without violating long-held liberal and Western diplomatic norms. So you need to lay a predicate, and that predicate was targeted abuse and harassment.
I totally agree. There's a lot more to this story, and I do believe that the key is in Harry's visa. So only time will tell. Hopefully, the justice system will side on the American people's side, to which we deserve transparency. But what do you guys think? I hope this clears up some things and makes you see what had been going on over the last couple of years and why we're seeing what we're seeing now, with the Harkles shifting their direction towards focusing on the kids now. It's all about the kids. And this is where all of these groups had to pivot, because now it's about kids' safety, because they've been called out, they've been exposed, and the American people are slowly catching on, but not fast enough. So definitely like this video, share it wherever you can. As always, I will be back with more content, but until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
You're such a fraud.